Educational options for deaf and hard of hearing students. So the first thing we're going to talk about is residential schools with bicultural and bilingual. And this allows for deaf individuals to communicate with hearing and non-hearing individuals while also learning. Some deaf individuals do not have the luxury of being able to learn just one language. Being a deaf bilingual can be difficult for some. Learning another language besides ASL is rather difficult. Some pros about residential school is that bicultural bilingual has more to offer deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Besides being a multicultural school, it allows for individuals who are hearing and deaf to share a school and learn to communicate with one another. Likewise, bicultural bilingual environment, ASL, serves as the first and instructional language. Other languages used, but ASL serves as the dominant language in their residential schools. A few cons with bilingual and bicultural schools is that deaf and hard of hearing individuals are sharing a school with hearing individuals where hearing language is usually seen as the dominant language. Although ASL is being used, a majority of students are hearing, which excludes deaf and hard of hearing individuals out of some scenarios. This con can also lead to another, which is isolation, with some deaf and hard of hearing individuals may feel left out and cannot contribute because of the language barrier.
So mainstreaming is putting a deaf or hard of hearing student into a public school system. Public Law 94/142 is the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and it made it possible for children with disabilities to get an education in the least restrictive environment and promotes them to attend school with their peers. And the least restrictive environment just pertains to the law stating that children with disabilities should be in classrooms with non-disabled students as much as possible for their situation, and that students are not removed from classroom settings unless it's absolutely necessary. Free and appropriate education is an educational right for all students in the United States to have access to free education and whatever services would make their education possible, and it's carried out with individual educational evaluations. So there are pros and cons to mainstreaming, and some of the pros is instead of deaf children being sent off to a school hundreds of miles away, because usually you're not around a deaf school, they can kind of get disconnected from their families since they can be far away. And as a young child, you need your parents or like a close caretaker, and those relationships can be affected in the future. It can also be more beneficial to place them in a mainstreaming school because they have access to extracurricular activities such as playing sports, participating in the arts, and joining clubs. And that can have a great impact on their social life and help improve their confidence and sense of belonging as well. And then there's also some cons. It's hard for the child to be able to lip read and engage in discussions if there's no interpreter. And even like informal conversations, those like are hard to read. And sometimes teachers have their back turned and you don't get that conversation. And even when informal conversations do occur between classmates, sometimes it can feel really forced or repeated, or it may feel really awkward for them. So it may be hard for them to make real friendships too. So it's ultimately up to the parents to decide what to do, but those are the pros and cons.
Next, we're talking about an itinerant in the classroom. So going off of mainstream, this is a trained professional who's almost like a teacher's aide in the classroom. They provide the opportunity for students to be pre-taught the subject. So when they go into the actual classroom, they already know the content that's being covered. So it gives them a better understanding rather than, like we talked about before, focusing on other things or if the teacher's back is turned. More pros to this is it's also available in public schooling, and it provides that extra support to the student and one-on-one time between the student and the itinerant. So they're able to really get the best out of that education. Cons for this, it could be harder for students to understand their place within the classroom because they are so fixated on learning in a different way, and it also puts extra pressure on that student in order to learn and learn it twice essentially. So before class and then during.
So next we're going to talk about resource rooms and self-contained classrooms. So a resource room is where a teacher of the deaf or a special education teacher will go into the classroom in a public school setting, and they'll teach the student in the classroom using ASL. And then at certain points during the day, they'll pull the student aside to a resource room. And this is where they will get more instruction and ask questions if they don't understand. A self-contained classroom is where children receive individualized or small group instruction in a separate classroom than a general education classroom. So they're pulled aside for the entire school day in a public school setting. No Child Left Behind is a national program that ensures that all children receive quality education through testing and analysis of subgroups, such as students with disabilities. Resource rooms and self-contained classrooms are help with this program because they ensure that the students are getting extra help when they need it. Some of the pros of these types of rooms include a better structure for learning for the students because they can go at their own pace, along with personalized instruction and one-on-one interaction from the teacher. Instead of being in a very large classroom with lots of hearing students, they can get more interaction with a teacher with a couple of their friends that are also deaf or hard of hearing. Some of the cons include being bullied from getting extra attention rather than their peers, and less social interaction with general education peers.
All right, so just some concluding thoughts for our presentation. We just want to reiterate that bicultural and bilingual residential schools are where American Sign Language is the first language used and English is the second language. And mainstreaming is when a deaf or hard of hearing student is sent to a public hearing school and learns in a regular classroom or in a separate classroom with a special education teacher. And an itinerant is a staff member whose purpose is to understand the specific needs of the child, often through an IEP, and they help to pre-teach concepts to further the education of the deaf child in the public school. Resource rooms are classrooms where a teacher of the deaf or a special education teacher instructs students with disabilities individually or in small groups, and they pull them out of their regular classrooms during specific points in the day. And self-contained classrooms are where children receive individual or small group instruction throughout the whole day by the teacher of the deaf or a special education teacher, rather than just part of the day like